October 4th, 1957. Across the Soviet Union, radio stations interrupt their regular programming with a special announcement. A metallic sphere, 23 inches in diameter and weighing 184 pounds, is orbiting Earth every 96 minutes. Its name is Sputnik, Russian for traveling companion. As it passes over the United States, Americans tune their radios to 20.005 and 40.002 megahertz and hear it. Beep, beep, beep. The sound is simple, almost innocent, but its implications are terrifying. The Soviet Union has beaten America into space. The same rockets that launched Sputnik could carry nuclear warheads to any city in the United States. There would be no warning, no defense. The technological superiority that Americans had taken for granted since World War II is suddenly in question. In living rooms across the nation, families stare at the night sky, searching for the moving point of light that represents Soviet achievement and American failure. In Washington, politicians demand answers. How did this happen? How did we fall behind? And most urgently, what are we going to do about it? The answer would come in the form of a new organization, created in the crucible of Cold War competition and national anxiety. Within months, the United States would transform its scattered competitive rocket programs into a unified civilian space agency. It would be called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. This is the story of how fear, ambition, scientific genius, and political will came together in 1958 to create the organization that would eventually put humans on the moon and reshape humanity's relationship with space. It's the story of how America decided that losing the space race was not an option, and how a handful of determined individuals built the institution that would win it. The path to NASA's creation began not with scientific curiosity, but with military competition and political fear. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had settled into a tense equilibrium of nuclear deterrence. Both superpowers possessed atomic weapons. Both were developing hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful. The prevailing doctrine was mutually assured destruction. If either side launched a nuclear attack, both nations would be annihilated. This grim calculus kept an uneasy peace, but it also drove relentless competition in military technology. Whoever achieved a decisive technological advantage might upset the balance. The key to delivering nuclear weapons was rocket technology. World War II had ended with Germany's V-2 rockets raining down on London. Terrifying proof that missiles could strike targets hundreds of miles away. After the war, both the United States and Soviet Union seized German rocket scientists and technology. America brought Wernher von Braun and his team to Alabama. The Soviets captured their own German engineers and the V-2 production facilities. The race was on to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that could deliver nuclear warheads across continents. By 1957, both nations were making progress, but the American public believed the United States was comfortably ahead. That illusion was about to be shattered. America's rocket program in the 1950s was fragmented and competitive. The Army, Navy, and Air Force each had their own missile development projects, each jealously guarding their budgets and territory. The Army's Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, led by Wernher von Braun, was developing the Redstone and Jupiter rockets. The Air Force was working on the Atlas and Thor ICBMs. The Navy had the Vanguard program, which President Eisenhower had designated as America's satellite launcher for the International Geophysical Year. There was also the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, a small civilian agency that had been conducting aeronautical research since 1915. NACA operated research facilities including the Langley Research Center in Virginia, the Ames Research Center in California, and the Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory in Ohio. These organizations rarely coordinated. They competed for funding, for talent, for recognition. The Army and Navy particularly disliked each other's programs. Von Braun's team was confident they could launch a satellite, but the Eisenhower administration had chosen the Navy's Vanguard instead, partly to emphasize the civilian, peaceful nature of American space efforts. This decision would prove costly when Sputnik beat them all. The Soviet space program was equally driven by military concerns, but far more centralized. Under the direction of chief designer Sergei Korolev, whose name was a state secret, the Soviets developed the R-7, Semyorka, the world's first true ICBM. The R-7 was massive, standing over 100 feet tall with a thrust of nearly 1 million pounds. It was designed to carry a nuclear warhead from the Soviet Union to the United States. But Korolev had grander ambitions. He convinced Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev that the R-7 could also launch satellites, demonstrating Soviet technological prowess to the world. The propaganda value would be immense, proof of communist superiority over capitalism. Khrushchev approved. Through 1957, the Soviets conducted test launches of the R-7, most of which failed. But on August 21, the R-7 successfully flew its full range. The rocket worked. 2 months later, on October 4, an R-7 launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, carrying Sputnik 1. The space age had begun, and America was watching from behind. The American reaction to Sputnik was immediate and visceral. Newspapers ran banner headlines, "Soviet satellite circles Earth," and "Red Moon over U.S." President Eisenhower tried to downplay the achievement, calling it one small ball in the air, and insisting it posed no military threat. But the public wasn't reassured. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead there too. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, speaking from his Texas ranch, declared that control of space means control of the world. Politicians demanded investigations. How had American intelligence missed this? Why wasn't the United States first? Democrats, smelling political blood, blamed the Republican administration for allowing a missile gap to develop. Scientists were equally shocked. Most had assumed American technology was superior. The bitter truth was that Soviet rocket engines were more powerful, their commitment more focused, their achievement undeniable. Within weeks, the Soviets made matters worse by launching Sputnik 2 on November 3, carrying a dog named Laika, proving they could launch living creatures. The psychological impact was devastating. America's confidence in its technological leadership was shaken to its core. The Eisenhower administration scrambled to respond. The president convened meetings with his science advisors. The military services lobbied furiously to get their programs funded and prioritized. The Navy's Vanguard program, which had been proceeding at a leisurely pace for the International Geophysical Year, was suddenly under intense pressure to launch America's first satellite. The date was set for December 6, 1957, just 2 months after Sputnik. The launch would be televised, demonstrating American technological competence to the world. On that December morning, millions watched as the Vanguard rocket ignited at Cape Canaveral. It rose about 4 feet off the launch pad, lost thrust, settled back down, and exploded in a massive fireball. The satellite, thrown clear, rolled away beeping mockingly from the wreckage. The press had a field day with the disaster. Foreign newspapers called it Kaputnik and Flopnik. It was a humiliation that made the Sputnik crisis even worse. America had not only been beaten into space, it had failed spectacularly in front of the world while trying to catch up. Something had to change, and change fast. In desperation, Eisenhower turned to the Army and Wendell von Braun. Given approval on November 8th, von Braun's team at Huntsville worked around the clock. They had a Jupiter-C rocket ready, essentially a Redstone with additional upper stages. On top, they would place Explorer 1, a satellite designed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. The satellite was small, just 30 pounds, but it carried scientific instruments, including a cosmic ray detector designed by Dr. James Van Allen of the University of Iowa. The launch was scheduled for late January 1958. On January 31st, after several weather delays, the Jupiter C lifted off from Cape Canaveral. The rocket performed flawlessly. Explorer 1 reached orbit. America finally had a satellite in space. More importantly, it was a scientific satellite. Van Allen's instruments would soon discover the radiation belt surrounding Earth, proving that American space efforts could contribute real scientific knowledge, not just propaganda victories. The country breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the larger question remained: how should America organize itself for the space age? The current system of competing military programs clearly wasn't working. President Eisenhower, a former five-star general who understood military competition, also recognized the dangers of militarizing space. He believed strongly that space exploration should be conducted by a civilian agency, not by the Army, Navy, or Air Force. Militarizing space would turn it into another battlefield, escalate tensions with the Soviets, and potentially lead to war. Moreover, a civilian space program would have more international legitimacy and will be better positioned to conduct peaceful scientific research. Eisenhower also understood that the military services, left to their own devices, would continue their wasteful competition for prestige and funding. What was needed was a single, unified organization with a clear mission. In his January 1958 State of the Union address, Eisenhower announced his intention to create a civilian space agency. He tasked his science advisor, Dr. James Killian of MIT, with developing the proposal. The challenge was to create this agency quickly while navigating the intense political and bureaucratic resistance from the military services, which didn't want to give up their rocket programs. Dr. Killian and his team worked quickly through the winter and spring of 1958. They studied various models for organizing space activities. Should it be a military agency like the Atomic Energy Commission? Should it be an independent agency? Should it be built from scratch or based on an existing organization? They consulted with scientists, engineers, and administrators. The consensus emerged that the best approach was to build on the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. NACA had 8,000 employees, 3 major research centers, and a 43-year history of aeronautical research. It was civilian, respected, and had valuable expertise in high-speed flight and aerodynamics, knowledge directly applicable to spacecraft design. The new agency would absorb NACA and add to it the relevant space programs from the military services and other government agencies. On April 2, 1958, President Eisenhower sent draft legislation to Congress. It was called the National Aeronautics and Space Act. The bill proposed creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to conduct civilian space research and exploration. The military would retain responsibility for space systems related to national defense, but the new NASA would lead America's peaceful exploration of space. The bill faced intense debate in Congress. Senator Lyndon Johnson, who chaired the Special Committee on Space and Astronautics, pushed for a stronger space program with more military involvement. He believed space would be a battlefield and wanted the Pentagon to have more control. Meanwhile, military leaders testified about the importance of their programs. The Air Force argued that its missile expertise made it the logical choice to lead space efforts. The Army defended von Braun's team and their proven track record. The Navy wanted to continue Vanguard. Behind the scenes, deals were made and compromises reached. The final legislation created NASA as a civilian agency, but allowed the military to conduct its own space activities related to defense. NASA would have authority to contract with the military services and take over facilities and programs relevant to civilian space exploration. The bill passed the Senate on June 16th by a vote of 75-1. The House passed it on July 16th by voice vote. On July 29, 1958, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act into law. NASA officially came into existence. Now, it just had to be built. With the law passed, the urgent work of actually creating NASA began. President Eisenhower needed to appoint an administrator to lead the new agency. The choice was crucial: This person would set the tone and direction for America's space program. After considering several candidates, Eisenhower selected Dr. T. Keith Glennon, president of Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. Glennon was 54, an experienced administrator, and a Republican with good political connections. He had previously served on the Atomic Energy Commission, giving him experience with large-scale technical programs. As deputy administrator, Eisenhower chose Dr. Hugh Dryden, who had been the last director of NACA. Dryden, 60, was a respected aeronautical engineer and scientist who provided continuity from NACA to NASA. On August 19, 1958, Glennon was sworn in as NASA's first administrator. He faced a monumental challenge: transform NACA from an aeronautical research committee into a space agency capable of competing with the Soviet Union, and do it fast. NASA officially opened for business on October 1, 1958, exactly 1 year and 3 days after Sputnik shocked the world. The agency inherited NACA's 8,000 employees and its 3 research centers: Langley in Virginia, Ames in California, and Lewis, later renamed Glenn, in Ohio. It inherited NACA's budget of about $100 million annually, and its facilities valued at hundreds of millions more. But this was just the beginning. The Space Act had given NASA authority to take over relevant space programs from other agencies. Within months, NASA absorbed the Navy's Vanguard program and its engineers. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory operated by Caltech for the Army was transferred to NASA on December 3, 1958, bringing 2,500 employees and expertise in satellites and space probes. Most significantly, on July 1, 1960, NASA gained the Army Ballistic Missile Agency's Development Operations Division, Wernher von Braun and his team of rocket engineers. They brought with them the Redstone and Jupiter rockets and years of experience. Von Braun's group became the nucleus of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. With these transfers, NASA grew rapidly from 8,000 to over 10,000 employees by 1960, with more growth to come. Glennon moved quickly to establish NASA's priorities and programs. The agency would pursue multiple objectives: scientific research, human spaceflight, robotic exploration, and aeronautics. For scientific missions, NASA continued the Explorer series of satellites and began planning ambitious probes to the Moon, Venus, and Mars. The Pioneer program would send spacecraft beyond Earth orbit. For human spaceflight, the highest priority given political pressures, NASA initiated Project Mercury in October 1958, just weeks after opening. Mercury's goal was straightforward: put a man in orbit around Earth and return him safely before the Soviets did. The program required developing a space capsule, life support systems, and selection and training of astronauts. Glennon established a space task group at Langley to manage Mercury, led by Robert Gilruth. Max Fadget designed the Mercury capsule. Meanwhile, plans were already being discussed for what would come after Mercury: missions to the Moon. NASA also established a coherent structure with field centers focused on specific areas: Langley for aeronautics and spacecraft design, Lewis for propulsion, Ames for research, JPL for robotic spacecraft, and eventually Marshall for rockets. This organization brought order to what had been chaos. The transformation wasn't seamless. NASA faced enormous challenges. It had to integrate organizations with different cultures: NACA's methodical research approach, JPL's academic culture, the military precision of von Braun's team. It had to compete with the military services for funding, talent, and missions. The Air Force in particular resented NASA's existence and fought to maintain its own space programs. NASA had to establish relationships with aerospace contractors, companies like McDonnell, North American, Lockheed, and Boeing, who would build the actual hardware. It had to create new procedures for everything from safety to procurement to public affairs. The agency had to recruit thousands of new employees, mostly engineers and scientists, during a period of high demand for technical talent. And it had to do all this while simultaneously conducting missions, launching rockets, and trying to catch up to the Soviet Union. The pressure was immense. Failure wasn't just embarrassing, It could lead to NASA's dissolution and return of space to military control. Everything depended on demonstrating results quickly. On April 9, 1959, NASA introduced America to its first astronauts. 7 military test pilots had been selected from a pool of 110 candidates to fly Project Mercury. They were Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton, the Mercury 7. The selection process had been rigorous and sometimes bizarre. Candidates underwent extensive medical testing, including stress tests, centrifuge runs, heat chamber sessions, and psychological evaluations. They were poked, prodded, questioned, and pushed to their limits to ensure they could withstand the stresses of spaceflight. The final 7 were introduced at a press conference in Washington, D.C. They appeared in their military uniforms, confident and capable, exactly the image NASA needed. The American public instantly embraced them as heroes. Life magazine signed an exclusive contract to tell their personal stories, turning them into celebrities. These men, average age 34, all married with children, all military officers, would become the face of NASA and symbols of American courage and determination in the space race. The Mercury 7 began intensive training in 1959. They practiced in simulators at Langley, learning every switch and procedure in the Mercury capsule. They underwent survival training, learning to survive in jungles, deserts, and oceans in case their capsule landed off target. They experienced weightlessness in brief periods aboard Air Force C-131 aircraft flying parabolic arcs. They trained in centrifuges to experience the G-forces of launch and re-entry. They studied orbital mechanics, spacecraft systems, and astronomy. They also worked closely with engineers, providing feedback on capsule design from a pilot's perspective. The astronauts insisted on having a window and manual controls. They wanted to fly the spacecraft, not just ride in it as passengers. This input improved the Mercury design significantly. Meanwhile, the competition to be first in space intensified. Alan Shepard was secretly selected as the prime pilot for the first flight, with Gus Grissom and John Glenn as backups. But before any American would fly, the race took another turn. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union achieved another stunning first. They put a human in orbit. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin circled Earth once in his Vostok capsule, spending 108 minutes in space before landing safely. The flight was a complete success. Gagarin became an international hero, his smiling face appearing on magazine covers worldwide. The Soviets had beaten America again, not just to space, but to putting a human there. The psychological impact was devastating. For the second time in 4 years, the United States appeared to be losing the space race, decisively. NASA's Mercury program had been delayed by technical problems. The first Mercury Redstone test flight in November 1960 had risen only 4 inches before the engine shut down, an embarrassing failure. Another test in December worked, but NASA's caution meant no American had yet flown. Now the Soviets had orbited a man while America hadn't even achieved a suborbital flight. President John F. Kennedy, who had taken office in January 1961, was furious and frustrated. He demanded to know when NASA would fly an American. Alan Shepard finally got his chance on May 5, 1961. His Mercury Redstone 3 flight, dubbed Freedom 7, launched from Cape Canaveral at 9:34 a.m. The flight lasted just 15 minutes and 22 seconds, reaching a maximum altitude of 116 miles before splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't orbital, just the ballistic arc, but Shepard became the first American in space. The nation breathed a sigh of relief. President Kennedy called Shepard personally. 3 days later, Kennedy addressed Congress and issued one of the most audacious challenges in American history. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. It was a stunning pronouncement. NASA had been in existence for less than 3 years. It had conducted exactly one manned spaceflight lasting 15 minutes, and now the president was committing the nation to going to the moon within 9 years. Many thought it impossible, but Kennedy understood that America needed a goal so ambitious that the Soviets couldn't easily achieve it first, something that would require the full mobilization of American technology, industry, and determination. Kennedy's moon challenge transformed NASA. The agency had been created to respond to Sputnik, to demonstrate American technological capability, to compete with the Soviets. But the goals had been somewhat vague: general space exploration and research. Now NASA had a specific, time-bounded objective: land on the moon by 1969. Everything else became secondary. The budget implications were staggering. NASA's budget in 1961 was about $500 million. To reach the moon would require multiples of that, billions of dollars annually. Tens of thousands of additional employees would be needed. New facilities would have to be built: a massive rocket assembly building, new launch pads for rockets far larger than anything that existed, a mission control center, astronaut training facilities. The entire Apollo program, as it was named, would eventually employ over 400,000 people across NASA, contractors, and universities. It would consume $25 billion, about $280 billion in 2025 dollars. It was the largest peaceful mobilization of resources in human history, and it all fell on NASA's shoulders, an agency that was barely 3 years old when Kennedy issued his challenge. NASA's leadership changed to meet the moon challenge. T. Keith Glennon had stepped down when Kennedy took office, a typical change with new administrations. Kennedy appointed James Webb as NASA's second administrator in February 1961. Webb, 54, was a lawyer and former director of the Bureau of the Budget with deep political connections. Unlike Glennon, Webb wasn't a scientist or engineer, but he was a brilliant administrator and negotiator. He understood Washington politics and knew how to fight for NASA's budget. Webb would lead NASA through its greatest expansion and most significant achievements. Under Webb's leadership, NASA reorganized to manage Apollo. The agency created new field centers: the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas, now Johnson Space Center, which would design the Apollo spacecraft and serve as mission control, and the Launch Operations Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida, now Kennedy Space Center, which would handle all launches. NASA also expanded Marshall Space Flight Center's role. Von Braun's team would develop the Saturn rocket family needed to reach the moon.
The technical challenges of Apollo were immense. NASA had to design 3 spacecraft: the command module, where astronauts would live during most of the flight; the service module, containing life support and propulsion; and the lunar module that would land on the moon. The agency had to build a rocket powerful enough to send all of this to the moon. The Saturn V would stand 363 feet tall and generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust. New technologies had to be invented: guidance computers small enough to fit in a spacecraft, yet powerful enough to navigate to the moon; spacesuits that could protect astronauts on the lunar surface; fuel cells to generate electricity, and much more. NASA had to train astronauts for spacewalks and develop rendezvous and docking techniques. The agency also had to figure out how to actually get to the moon: direct ascent, Earth orbit rendezvous, or lunar orbit rendezvous. After intense debate, NASA selected lunar orbit rendezvous in 1962, a decision that made Apollo feasible. Every technical challenge seemed almost impossible, but NASA's engineers, scientists, and contractors attacked each problem systematically.
NASA built up its workforce rapidly through the 1960s. By 1966, the agency employed 36,000 civil servants directly. Another 376,000 people worked for NASA contractors, companies like North American Aviation, Command and Service Modules, Grumman, Lunar Module, Boeing, Saturn V First Stage, IBM, Computers, and hundreds of others. Universities conducted research funded by NASA. This massive industrial effort created jobs across the United States. Congressional support remained strong because nearly every state had NASA-related employment. The budget grew to over $5 billion annually by the mid-1960s, nearly 5% of the federal budget and more than 34% of all American R&D spending. NASA became one of the largest and most visible federal agencies. It attracted top talent, brilliant engineers and scientists who wanted to be part of humanity's greatest adventure. The culture was intense, long hours, tight deadlines, constant pressure, but it was also inspiring. Everyone at NASA knew they were working on something historic, something that would define their generation. NASA's rapid progress was stunned by tragedy on January 27, 1967. During a routine launch pad test for Apollo 1, fire broke out in the command module. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were trapped inside. The hatch, which opened inward, couldn't be opened against the cabin pressure. All three astronauts died of asphyxiation within seconds. The accident was a devastating blow to NASA and the nation. The subsequent investigation revealed numerous problems: flammable materials in the cabin, pure oxygen atmosphere, poor wiring, and inadequate emergency procedures. NASA faced intense criticism. The agency's aggressive schedule and pressure to meet Kennedy's deadline had led to shortcuts and oversights. James Webb defended NASA before Congress, but also accepted responsibility. The Apollo program was grounded for nearly 2 years while the command module was completely redesigned. Fire-resistant materials replaced flammable ones. The hatch was redesigned to open outward in seconds. Wiring was improved. Hundreds of changes were made. The accident was a searing reminder that spaceflight was dangerous and that safety couldn't be compromised. But NASA emerged from the tragedy stronger and more careful, though the loss of Grissom, White, and Chaffee would haunt the agency forever. NASA rebuilt and returned to flight. In October 1968, Apollo 7 successfully tested the redesigned command module in Earth orbit. Then, in a bold decision, NASA sent Apollo 8 around the moon in December 1968, the first humans to leave Earth orbit and see the far side of the moon. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders orbited 10 times, broadcasting live images and reading from Genesis on Christmas Eve to an audience of millions. The mission was a triumph, proving that NASA could navigate to the moon and return safely. Apollo 9 and Apollo 10 tested the lunar module and rehearsed all procedures except the actual landing. By mid-1969, NASA was ready for the ultimate attempt. The organization that had been created in crisis just 11 years earlier, the agency that had struggled to launch even small satellites, was about to attempt something that seemed impossible: landing humans on another world. The Soviet Union had also been racing to the moon with its own lunar program, but technical problems and the death of chief designer Sergei Korolev in 1966 had set them back. NASA had a chance to win the space race definitively. On July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon while Michael Collins orbited above. Armstrong's first step onto the lunar surface and his words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," marked the achievement of President Kennedy's goal with 5 months to spare. NASA had done it. America had won the space race. The success vindicated NASA's creation, justified the enormous investment, and demonstrated what the United States could accomplish when unified by a common goal. The images of astronauts on the moon, the American flag planted in lunar soil, and Earth rising over the lunar horizon became defining symbols of the 20th century. Apollo 11 was followed by 5 more successful moon landings through 1972. NASA's achievement was complete. The organization that had been created in response to Sputnik had not only caught up to the Soviet Union, it had surpassed them entirely, accomplishing something that remains unprecedented more than 50 years later. NASA's creation in 1958 was a response to crisis, but it became something far greater, an institution that pushed the boundaries of human achievement and inspired generations. The organization was born from Cold War competition and national anxieties about Soviet technological superiority. It was created by politicians who feared America was falling behind, by a president who believed space should be peaceful, and by scientists and engineers who saw an opportunity to explore the unknown. In its first decade, NASA transformed from a small aeronautical research committee into the agency that put humans on the moon. That achievement required unprecedented cooperation between government, industry, and academia. It required innovation on every level: technical, organizational, and managerial. It required courage from astronauts willing to risk their lives and dedication from thousands of workers who labored in obscurity. NASA proved that Americans could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together toward a common goal. The agency showed that democracy and free enterprise could compete with and surpass totalitarian systems. NASA's success in the 1960s validated its creation and established it as a permanent institution that would continue exploring space for decades to come. Today, NASA continues the work that began in 1958. The Space Shuttle program flew 135 missions from 1981 to 2011, making space more accessible. NASA helped build and operate the International Space Station, a permanent human presence in orbit that represents cooperation between former Cold War rivals. The agency has sent robotic probes throughout the solar system, to every planet, to asteroids and comets, beyond the solar system itself. The Hubble Space Telescope and James Webb Space Telescope have revealed the universe in unprecedented detail. NASA's Mars rovers have explored the red planet for decades. The Artemis program is preparing to return humans to the moon and eventually send them to Mars. All of this traces back to that moment in October 1958 when a small aeronautics committee became a space agency. NASA's creation was a direct response to Sputnik, but its legacy extends far beyond the Cold War. The agency represents humanity's drive to explore, to understand, to reach beyond our limits. It demonstrates that when we dare to attempt the impossible, we sometimes succeed. NASA didn't just help America win the space race. It helped humanity become a spacefaring civilization. The creation of NASA in 1958 was one of the most significant moments in American history. Born from the Sputnik crisis and Cold War competition, the agency transformed fear into achievement, rivalry into exploration, and national ambition into human accomplishment. Within 11 years of its founding, NASA put humans on the moon, an achievement that seemed impossible when the agency opened its doors. That success validated NASA's creation and established the model for how humanity would explore space for generations to come. The organization, built by Eisenhower, Webb, von Braun, and thousands of dedicated individuals, proved that the impossible becomes possible when courage meets determination, when talent meets opportunity, and when a nation commits itself to a worthy goal. Thank you for watching this story of how NASA was created during the Cold War. If you enjoyed learning about the birth of America's space agency, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from space history. Hit the like button and leave a comment about which NASA mission or achievement you'd like to explore next. In our next video, we'll continue the story with Apollo 11, how NASA landed the first humans on the moon and achieved President Kennedy's seemingly impossible goal. As President Kennedy said when challenging America to go to the moon, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. That spirit of attempting the difficult, of refusing to accept limits, of pushing boundaries, that spirit defined NASA's creation and continues to drive the agency today as we prepare to return to the moon and venture to Mars.